And now that story I promised you with Eusebius McKaiser. On the 14th of May, the headmaster of Red Hill School, Joseph Gerasi, put out a note to his community, the parents who pay the school fees, to, in his words, encourage their children not to discuss this issue at school. He was referring to his pupils expressing themselves on the Israel-Palestine conflict. He described the behavior of elements within his school as bullying, unkind, and discriminatory. He subsequently apologized for what I would term the blanket ban on conversations about the issue. So broadcaster and analyst Eusebius McKaiser responded to Gerasi's note on Twitter, saying something along the lines of, "This man's not fit to run a creche," which is pretty harsh, but let's ask him. What prompted that reaction, Eusebius?
Good afternoon, Omar. The reaction was prompted by something very simple, that the educational purpose of schooling is to develop citizens that can hopefully count a little bit, can read for comprehension, but crucially, as tomorrow's leaders, to also have the ability to reason analytically, particularly about the most difficult questions of the day. So if you're going to shut down debate and discussion, then you are sending the message to teenagers that when things get difficult, choose silence. That is not a good pedagogical philosophy. Any headmaster worth employing should be leading from the front how to have deep disagreement without undermining the dignity of your interlocutor, and to make sure that your school has enculturated amongst its staff and its pupils a culture of debate that doesn't leave anyone feel as if their dignity is undermined. But what he chose was to walk away from difficulty instead of taking this as the perfect world crisis to role model difficult conversation for the pupils of the school.
So he subsequently apologized, and my understanding is many headmasters, mistresses at schools all over this country are all concerned about what they would term a conversation out of control in an environment that they cannot manage. So that's, I think, what his key issue was. There's this bullying, there's people are shouting above each other, and I think he's implied, as so many others have wanted, can we do this in a, in inverted commas, safe space, and can we allow this to be facilitated by experts? Is that the right approach?
Well, firstly, before we talk about the right approach, I want to disagree with his description of the situation that he is confronted with, even though I haven't in a while been to Red Hill. The idea that there is verbal warfare on campus is firstly likely not true, but secondly, even if it is true, it's an indictment on his leadership, because the question is, what have you done as a prestigious elite school up until this point, Omar, to make sure that you have instilled in your pupils the ability to engage difficult questions of the day? And so to suddenly commit yourself in a future-oriented way from tomorrow to begin to think about healthy norms for difficult conversation, that is actually, it tells me as a parent that all along my child had been attending a private school that doesn't already have in its nuts and bolts, in its extramural activities, the kind of environment where children can routinely discuss everything from animal rights, South African politics, to what happens in the Middle East. And the school environment, may I add, is also actually quite choreographed and safe. Not in the same kind of way as Twitter or Facebook, where there is a lot of online bullying, where there are a lot of recalcitrant views from people who are not open to persuasion. So if anything, the school is the perfect place where you can build a safety container and where you can actually role model what are really the optimal epistemic norms when it comes to productive dialogue. To describe the school environment as a place that is almost beyond the pale for productive dialogue is to give up on your pupils and to give up on your mission as a leader within the education sector.
Now, important to let you know, as an eNCA viewer, that we did invite Joseph Gerasi to the studio for this discussion, and he politely turned us down. We're going to continue the conversation. Anton, I want to ask, based on what we've just been discussing, is there any subject matter that shouldn't be brought into a university or school environment? Is there anything that you would say, no, we can't discuss that here, or is everything open as long as it's these two environments?
Well, certainly universities should be open spaces for people to exchange views about absolutely anything. School, you're dealing with younger people, you might want to be more cautious, but you certainly don't want to stop conversation. around a major global issue more so. You want to find ways to turn this into a learning experience. I think Eusebius is spot on, for how to manage and have these debates in full, in an impassioned way, without it deteriorating into hostility or violence or abuse.
So let's move a few thousand kilometers away, Eusebius. In the US, Ivy League universities, generally liberal, left-leaning, one tends to describe and label these things, unfortunately, I think. Even there are often occasions where fascist, right-wing, racist, clearly racist people have been stopped from speaking at these institutions because the entire student body and the teaching faculty disagree with those views vehemently and believe there should be zero platform for that kind of, racist outpourings. What are your thoughts on that?
On this point, Omar, you and I had this discussion off air. There's actually complexity here that we didn't manage to get into on the phone. And here's the complexity. I'm a liberal about free speech. I'm not a libertarian. Even if you are a liberal committed to the values in our Constitution, you will still recognize that there are limits to speech. For example, hate speech is completely unacceptable. When I was at Oxford, we had a massive debate at the Oxford Union about whether David Irving, the infamous Holocaust denialist, should be given a platform in the Oxford Union. At the time, my view was, let him come. Let's undermine him on the platform. Let's show him to be evidence insensitive. Let's show him to be morally callous and defeat him in the chamber of the Oxford Union. Many, many years later, as I'm sitting here now, already 40 years old, I think back to that position that I had as a postgraduate student, and I'm now no longer so sure, Omar, because now I think to myself, my interlocutors within the union who wanted to no platform David Irving, I don't think I took sufficient cognizance of their concern that you are re-inscribing harm into the public space when it comes to the survivors of the Holocaust by giving this man a platform when he has already, through documentation, been defeated on the substantive questions time and time again. So in general, we should have a bias in favor of more rather than less speech, and then teach children and adults, for that matter, what critical thinking consists of. But I don't think that I'm a libertarian on free speech. I think one can be deeply committed to a progressive interpretation of the Constitution, and actually, to your question that you posed to Anton, make a liberal case for why in certain circumstances, but there will be very few, you should not give a platform to certain kind of morally odious views.
Anton?
Yes, I mean, certainly there are views that are socially unacceptable. And the most obvious one is racism or anti-Semitism. And that shouldn't be, the rules should be, get into this debate, but if we hear anything that's racist or anti-Semitic, you've broken the rules, and the rules say you can't do that. So I also agree there are limits on free speech, but we have to maximize debate as much as we can short of that limit. And where that limit is a matter of constant debate and depends often on the circumstances and of the time.
So let me be a bit trivial about this. Are we suggesting that this blatantly racist person shouldn't be given a platform because we don't believe that their views are changeable in any way? Because the reason for dialogue, the reason for all of these conversations is always that interrogation, that engagement, that debate potentially has the power, through language and the discourse, of changing views, of bringing people back to what we all would agree are the kind of values we prefer in our societies. Is that what we say? We condemn that and say, can't do it. This person is intractable. Let me start with you, Eusebius, on that.
Well, I mean, I'm lucky that I've been through, and I want to be solution-oriented at the same time in answering your question. I'm lucky that I went through a formal debate program in high school, at Rhodes University, and at Oxford. So I have the ability to handle difficult conversation because it's part of my training. If I was part of the Ministry of Basic Education, I would recognize that the ability to think and reason critically is not an intrinsic spin-off of a good basic education focusing on other subject matter. We need to introduce into the schooling system and at university a very specific curriculum that aims at critical thinking, and not to assume that if I've got my BSc degree, I must be intrinsically a critical thinker. So my view was always, even as a talk show host on radio, put anyone on the line. If someone wants to defend the apartheid states as having been misunderstood, I'll take them on. So I'm with Anton, we should have maximum speech. But I think our biggest problem is that social media and technology has given everyone a platform without the tools with which to get to engage in productive dialogue. So I'm not so much keen on having a long shopping list of topics or people that should be no platformed. I think that's anti-democratic in general, but for the very few circumstances most of us would agree on. I think our biggest challenge as a society, Omar, and I think it's not unique to South Africa, is what can we do to develop a toolbox that is a toolbox that enables you to engage in productive dialogue, and how do we begin to teach that from school as well as all the way up into Parliament, where you have adults that didn't go through it in school, which is why we have such impoverished social and political discourse in South Africa.
Anton?
Yeah, look, I would always lead in favor of dialogue and debate and argument and discussion and the value of that. So I would say in a school, almost always, not always, but almost always, it would be better to use the opportunity to teach kids to argue and debate and understand and critically engaged, and hopefully knock down people who say offensive things. And to deal with offensive talk as well. We have to learn to deal with it appropriately and knock it down and take it on and challenge it. So I always lean that way, but I absolutely accept that, particularly in this area of social media, that we have a particular problem with abuse and harassment and disinformation, that in fact we need new tools to deal with it, because it is a new situation.
I'm glad you both mentioned social media. So this it's not new. It's now labeled as cancel culture, but it's always been there. How does one deal with a society that potentially is on an inexorable trajectory towards political correctness because of the way we behave? That is a serious concern, because we eventually always gravitate towards particular views that are acceptable in society, and that can only lead to mediocrity. How does one deal with that? Eusebius.
Okay, I'm happy to start first. So the first thing is that, social media was actually a really fascinating space to analyze your question on. I mean, if I look at the behavior of the likes of Helen Ziller, Tony Leon, what they do is actually profoundly illiberal. Sometimes it's easy to say to someone, you're just being politically correct. You don't want me to speak. You are just some sort of, I don't know, feminazi, for example. That's a response of many misogynists to strong women on Twitter. But actually what you find is it's a case of gaslighting very often on the part of the person who says, let me speak. Why don't you accept that in this platform all of us can have a viewpoint? Don't shut me down just because I'm a white male. Often that kind of move is a preemptive strike to not deal with the substantive moral criticism of your views that you have expressed that caused the feelings of complete disapproval amongst a group of people. So when I watch the speech acts performed on Twitter by the likes of Helen Ziller and Tony Leon, they think that they are defending the principle of free speech, but actually they just want to get away with saying all sorts of things, not based on the evidence, things that are morally outrageous in the historical context of where South Africa is at and how we got to the point where we're at currently. And so it's a bit fashionable to try and not deal with criticism by implying that the critic is simply trying to police your thought and your freedom of expression rights.
Anton, how would you respond to that?
The best way to deal with the problem that Eusebius is highlighting is to take it on. So I don't think anyone really wants to or can cancel Helen Ziller. She keeps crying that she's being cancelled, but she's one of the loudest voices in our society, and good for her. The way to deal with it is to take her on, to say, this is why you're wrong, and this is why you might be very wrong, and this is where you got the facts wrong, and this is where you're misreading things. That's the way to deal with it. I do find often that those who cry cancel culture are the loudest voices in our society. And what it does, it reflects from the fact that there are many, many other voices that are not heard, or seldom heard, or hardly heard in our public debate. And that's a bigger issue than prominent people not getting the response they want when they speak.
So if one is running these platforms like Twitter, where we know people are, feel very comfortable because they're anonymized in some ways, to be able to say whatever they think, and often it's vitriol, how does somebody like management at Twitter make those very difficult decisions about what's acceptable and what's not? Do we have a view on that, Eusebius? I mean, this is not a new debate.
Absolutely, it's not a new debate. I mean, I think that's an important starting point to recognize, Omar. You chose to have Anton and myself on your platform. You made a decision about which voices not to have on. So the idea of an editorial decision being taken by the managers of Twitter shouldn't make us go, oh my God, the Twitter leadership are being illiberal. On a daily basis, editors take that kind of decision all the time. Of course, what the technologies have done is to democratize that discursive space by allowing more voices to be heard and not to be victims of editorial gatekeeping. But the idea of not giving someone a platform just because they have a view is an old idea with old technologies and old media like hard copy print of the newspapers, and no one said that it is wrong for an op-ed editor to decide what to leave out. So that is important to keep in mind. Where do you draw that line? It's going to differ from generation to generation. There are certain kinds of jokes that I could crack 10 years ago, and it would go down very well with any audience, where now I have to rethink it. There are things I've said 5 years ago on Power FM as well as on 702, where I'm not sure if I would frame the discussion the same way. Like, for example, I used to vocalize the K word with gay abandon in order to draw attention to it and debate it. Now I might do it, but I'm first going to lose sleep over it. And so I think even though these decisions are hard to take, if you are an administrator of a platform, you've got to take the hard decisions and to ask yourself, what are the baseline, minimally decent standards that must be upheld? And it will be minimal, but some people will sometimes trample even on your minimal standards of decency, and those ones like Trump should either be kicked out or particular content from them should be blocked so that you don't have more harm spilling into the public space.
Thank you very much, Eusebius, McKaiser, Anton Harber, for joining me here today. And thank you also, Eusebius, for the criticism that we've got two people who seem to agree on everything. That's not my fault, Anton. I thought you'd speak up a bit.